This is
RedPubPod. RedPubPod, you got it. It's good.
a podcast
RedPubPod.
from Redhawk Publications.
RedPubPod.
RedPubPod.
But you need not know that.
Greetings from Redhawk Publications, a division of Catawba Valley Community College. My name is Patty Thompson, and I am the project coordinator for Redhawk. And with us today is our publisher, Robert Canipe.
Welcome to RedPubPod.
And also we have a very special guest today, poet, native of Hickory, Paul Jones. A little bit about Paul before we start speaking with him. Paul's been a retired professor from the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. 40 years he spent there as the clinical professor of the School of Information and Library Science, as well as with the School of Media and Journalism. An illustrious career of published poetry, including many journals, in addition to a chapbook, which won the North Carolina Writers Network Award, entitled What the Welsh and Chinese Have in Common, in addition to his book, Somewhere Wonderful, which was published by Redhawk Publications in the fall of last year. Paul is also nominated for 2 Pushcart Prizes, as well as 2 Best of the Web Awards, and as I always say, most importantly with Paul, he's got a manuscript that crashed into the moon's surface. So we'll hear a little bit more about that. But we just want to say, hey there, Paul.
Hello, and one small correction. The book is called Something Wonderful.
Something Wonderful.
Not Somewhere Wonderful, but if you're reading it, you are somewhere wonderful.
I like the way you
See,
put
I
that.
told you she had too much caffeine this morning already. So
Well, product names are important.
product names, brand identification, all of that good stuff. Yeah.
But as
There
he
we are,
mentioned,
publishers.
it
But
does
words are
indeed.
important to poets.
It brings me to a very special place when I read it.
What I mean.
Yes, me too. One of the things that I love about this book is how accessible your poetry is. As we have talked about on this show before, and as we have all experienced in the classroom, if you've taught poetry to students, the moment that you mention that you're going into your poetry section of your class, lots of students will groan and they will moan, and I will explain to them that not all poetry will speak to you, but you should at least experience some poetry. You'll find some that is accessible and some that is not, some that you will struggle with and some that you won't. Mr. Jones, what do you do to make your poetry so accessible to any reader who comes to it? That's one of the things that's great about Something Wonderful, is I identify with something in every poem in this book and every poem that you write.
Well, that's a kind of complicated question, but the easy part of the question is, the easy answer to part of the question is that I would like people to read and enjoy my poetry. So it depends on how you envision your audience. So for me, in some ways, it means thinking about how vocabulary works, thinking about how allusion works, and thinking about how references work. So many of the poems in here, and you've noticed a few that you mentioned, allude to other poetry. They speak back in time in a conversation with earlier poets. But you need not know that to appreciate a lot of the poems. For example, the one about the roommate Geoffrey is directly influenced in a kind of homage to Christopher Smart, an early English poet. It also has references within it to Chaucer and others, but one need not know much of that to just have fun with it.
Now, right now, you may pause this podcast, get on your phone, and look up Christopher Smart and Geoffrey Chaucer. If you are unsure as to who those people are, we'll wait for you. Okay, we're back.
But the idea is that it wants to a good poem to me, a good poem aspirations are what I have. Will try to reach at several levels. So you notice a lot of the poems in there are formal poems, but when I read them, almost no one notices, oh, that's a sonnet, that's a triolet, that's whatever. Poets notice, because the artifice of poetry is to make things seem immediate and real to every listener, everyone out there. the brew of poetry that I try to do has tradition, imagination, as well as personal involvement. And so a lot of poems and poets out there are about themselves and what they do. The I in almost all my poems is inflected through some place in the past and some experience and imagination.
It sounds like it's for when you read the children's books that are really for adults as well.
Yes.
So you're writing for all those levels, accessible for the layman, as well as for those like an Adrian Rice who can tear it apart, but he knows exactly what you're doing.
Exactly. I mean, if I could be a scriptwriter for Rocky and Bullwinkle, I would be a happy person.
You may also pause the podcast, go to Google, and look up Rocky and Bullwinkle. If you are unsure as to what that alludes to, we'll wait for you. Welcome back. I think history has a lot, plays a lot. You just mentioned things about the past. History plays a lot in your poetry as well, doesn't it? Not only your personal history, but personal or history that you have experienced in your generation. Am I wrong?
Well, I mean, I think as you said, as I tried to say, there are three things. So, yes, your personal a poet brings their personal experience and to a poem, sometimes indirectly and inflected, which is more what I try to do. So the I'm is, Philip Larkin once said about his own poetry. He goes, they're not the whole of me, and I'm not the whole of them. That the persona that you create, the voice that you speak, is driven by words and imagination and patterns. Now, some people seek to reveal themselves in that. I seek to understand other people in the world in that.
That's a nice transition into the question that, Patty, that you wanted to talk about what Mr. Jones has done for a living a lot of his life, and how he is as a craftsman. We were talking earlier about the right brain
And
left
the left brain. And
Yeah.
looking at your CV, because for our listeners, last evening we had a poetry reading where Paul was the featured guest, and I did some research in his background, and you have an extensive right brain. I mean, you're doing information library, cataloging. You've done some things with the internet. You've got
Something.
an extensive, I know, you created it. You've got the left brain going, but you also have the ability to have the right brain, and quite frankly, that's kind of a mutation. You're an alien in a good way, in that you can do both, Paul, and you excel at both. So I'm intrigued.
Well, it's easy to be broad if you're willing to be shallow. I try to be broad. That said, my background's in computer science. I was one of the first undergraduate computer science degrees granted from NC State in 1972. And they've recognized that for me, which is really nice. I've been able to, but my experience hiring and working with people is that this idea of brain division is not very real.
Okay.
That people solve problems sometimes with physical engagement, sometimes with imaginative engagement, and sometimes with musical engagement, and sometimes with linguistic engagement. The best and most imaginative coders I've had were almost always musicians. Because the work we do.
I can understand that.
Yeah.
Because music is basically math.
Exactly.
And math is a more concretized kind of language.
But even separately from math, the work of programming and, to some degree, the work of poetry is about pattern recognition.
Okay.
So understanding patterns and understanding languages that help create patterns. The language might be music, it might be coding, it might be English, or whatever native language. Understanding pattern recognition and how to manipulate patterns to have some overall effect. We see this in music when you shift from a minor to a major chord. You don't have, many listeners don't see that shift, but they're emotionally and physically affected by hearing that chord shift. Similarly, patterns in language, you'll hear people go, oh, I like the kind of rhyming you do. Like, I really don't know what, in fact, one editor who sent a hinged double sonnet back to me and said, I don't know what this form is, which means I will never send to him again. But it really is kind of intriguing. There must be some name for it. Yes, it's only been used since medieval time, no, since Renaissance. So, you don't need to know that to appreciate the effect that's going on. So that's true for music. Fred Brooks, in his Mythical Man Month book that's a touchstone for programmers, has a whole chapter on coding as the poetry of math. And if you think about music, or you see these mathematical patterns play out. If you think about formal poetry, you see this play out. If you think about actually really good free verse poetry that is more than just an outpouring of emotion, but attracts you somehow by the aural and temporal senses that go on, then that's also what goes on. So you don't want to be too highfalutin about it.
Right.
But, Bruce Springsteen and the Beastie Boys and Joni Mitchell, all those people are pounding on, you can hear patterns, you can hear the rhythms going on, you can hear, even if you're just listening to lyrics, how this goes on, how they do modulation, how you don't exactly repeat what was before, but you do an improvisation of it all, because now particularly we're sophisticated enough that things that are too iambic, we get lost in them. So the poet's challenge is to not stalk around like Frankenstein in verse, but to be a little more lithe, a little more light-footed.
What you've basically done here is proved to me that we've been indoctrinated to believe that things that are abstract were chaotic, but you're telling me now that actually there's patterns in abstraction. The arts, which we've always thought as being this kind of subjective thing, is more objective than we have been led to believe.
Well, we love innovation, but we also love tradition. So the two tensions of the creative, and this is true in all these, is to be new at one level and unique. But the other level, if you're so new and so unique, no one can understand what the hell's going on. On the other hand, you want to be grounded in something that is familiar. But if it's too familiar, it's trite, it's boring, it's overdone. So you have to kind of meet these middle grounds of how do you reach backward and pull things forward. And it's always been the challenge of going back to musicians again. A musician, your producer and label would really like you to do the same song as the last hit. And if you want to hear a complaint from any songwriter, Ray Davies, famously for Waterloo Station. Waterloo Station is a great song. No one, including Davies, is exactly sure what it's about, but the effect is very, very strong. And his label just went, do us an album of those songs. He goes, are you kidding me?
This brings a wonderful opportunity. If you don't mind, Paul, would you read us one of your poems? And bearing in mind what you just taught us, incorporating new based on something maybe more traditional, that would be kind of fun.
Well, let's do a couple that might be fun. One that everybody will recognize that is really an homage and a parody and just kind of fun. The red vinegar sauce. So much depends upon the red vinegar sauce dribbled on pulled pork beside the white coleslaw. And that's the North Carolina take on William Carlos Williams's So Much Depends on the Red Wheelbarrow. And it's there to be light, to be fun, and to take it to the religion of North Carolina, which is Lexington-style barbecue.
You may take time to Google William Carlos Williams, The Red Wheelbarrow, and we will have an entire podcast show about that poem at a later date.
That could be a T-shirt, a T-shirt sold at the Lexington Barbecue Festival for those folks who are interested. That is fun. Thank you.
So let's do another one here. That the saint of trees. What is the proper sacrifice to please our Lord, the saint of trees? I ask the ferns for their advice. What is the proper sacrifice? Lie here and dream of paradise. Sink into the soul like leaves. That is the proper sacrifice to please our Lord, the saint of trees. And so that's a promisal form called a triolet. But you don't need to know any of that. You don't need to know that this is what the troubadours did, hoping to woo someone, often describing landscape or describing love in the morning or describing other things, but to create a character, the saint of trees, to reuse this patterning. This is a heavily patterned, a very short poem, but with very heavy pattern restrictions. And you can break those restrictions, of course, but this one is pretty damn close.
I noticed that it's kind of like a call and respond, because the first verse is, like a call, and then apparently the saint of trees is talking to the reader in the second.
Or the ferns. Yeah.
Or the ferns are
Yeah.
talking in the second verse. Yes, the ferns.
Yeah, I used that, but that's not required.
Okay.
What is required is the pattern of the lines.
Okay.
So just for fun, the first line in the first verse is also the last line in the first verse. And then the second line is the last of that verse is the last line of the poem. And then the rhyme pattern is A, B, A, A, B, A, B. So, I mean, there's a lot to say about triolets, but, I like reading poems, and I have to say, I must have written 50 horrible versions before I hit on one that did what this poem does, that makes a character, that makes a conversation, that makes a response, as you noticed. The Provençal guys don't do that, but I just kind of got stuck. I went, well, you ask the ferns, what the hell do they say?
So is that a reflection of taking what is already an established pattern and adding your spin on it to then
Yeah.
make it yours to add to that?
Yeah, and also one of the things that I learned in trying to translate Welsh poetry is counter patterns in there that disturb it so that it's not quite so regular. So you'll hear some internal rhyme in there, please, for example, and it's in the middle of the line, where you don't expect the rhyme to be, and therefore it's a little less boring. You want to have a counter, just like good music.
Exactly.
If it's too much, if the chord progression is too predictable, and no hook ever shows up, you're not going to have a hit. People, and why don't you have hits? Because people don't get it. So you want, hopefully, and what pleases me is to know that there's a pattern there, to interfere with that pattern a little bit, and that helps heighten an emotionality to it. When it's less predictable, then there's a little emotional attachment to it. It lets you be able to talk. Your idea in a poem, I think, or in any piece of writing, is to have other people read it and possibly enjoy it, or at least follow the instructions and you'd like it to be an enjoyable experience and hopefully slightly memorable.
And I think that it interrupts without distracting.
That's the idea.
And without
yeah.
putting you off. And I'm reminded of tons of music that's like that. The first time I ever put on the album Big Science by Laurie Anderson
Oh,
back
right.
in 1980. I'm hearing these noises and these notes that I'm used to because I recognize the A chords and the B chords and the G chords, but the way she put it together was interrupting but still enjoyable. And 40 years later, I still put on that record, and I'm just enthralled
Yeah,
at what
she's
this woman has been able to do with music.
Yeah, she's a very good example of an innovator who also, pulls the tradition towards you. And as opposed to somebody who's like remaking the same hit. She would know, Anderson or even Patti Smith wouldn't do that.
Yep.
To talk about two really different creatives, one really rough and one really honed and inclusive and borrowing from people, influences like John Cage's deals or house music that actually records ambient music around ambient sounds and combines that into a musical experience.
Yeah, like Brian Eno has done, and Daniel Lanois, and the ambient stuff from the
Right.
70s and 80s.
But also, poets do this often. So, yesterday was the 100th anniversary of Philip Larkin's poems. Almost many, if not all of his poems, allude to a previous poem in English somehow. But you need not know that. He has one called Sad Steps, which is moderately famous. The title comes out of Sydney. Oh, sad steps, O moon, thou climbest the stars. And it's about, in Sydney's case, it's about untrue love. It's a little sonnet about untrue love. In Larkin's case, it's about age. His starts out, groping back to bed after taking a piss. I look at the moon and am amazed at something about its cleanliness. And he rhymes those rhymes, but then as he gets down, it's about looking out at the pre-dawn light and about death. It's the opposite of an abad, And he has a poem called Abad, too, that goes, I work all day and get half drunk at night, is the first lines of that. But it ends with the telephone squatting to ring in every rented room. That image of that. And but he's talking back and forth. But you need not know that to do it. His most famous poem, which I probably won't do here because it has more words that need to be bleeped, but is called This Be the Verse. This Be the Verse is probably the poem that is known in every bar in England. But it's an allusion, that one line, to Robert Louis Stevenson, who has a poem written, Here is the hunter home from the wood, here is the sailor home from the sea. And it ends, and this be the verse that be writ on my grave. And Larkin only does this be the verse, and then he has this thing about how your parents screw you up, etc., and don't have any kids yourself. And oddly, it will probably be the verse that is written imaginatively in the grave of people. Because when you ask someone, do you know a Philip Larkin poem? At any bar in England, 3/4 of the drunks will know that poem.
And I thank you for reading that last night, by the way.
Yeah.
That was
Yeah,
fun.
you can go to poetry.org and look that poem up, and you will enjoy it. What kind of a poem is I Do This, I Do That on page 45?
Okay, so that's a prose poem done this way. But when I do prose poems, I do other things in them. So the idea here is to use simple declarative sentences largely, and to create an idea of this character. It's also, so let me step out a minute and say, sometimes I want to make fun of other poets in poems. So one of the terms that I think Tom Lux, who I studied with, is a wonderful and very funny poet who died about 2 years ago, used to say, all these poets, they're writing about themselves. All their poems are, I do this, I do that poems. And so I went, I'll just write a poem that I do this, I do that. But I tried to create a particular character with a kind of ennui. It helped that COVID hadn't set, and all my friends were writing COVID poems, and I went, I think I can imagine a person in this position and get there.
Perform that one.
I will. I do this, I do that. I stay in bed too long most days. I boil water when half awake. Then I forget to add coffee. I'm out of tea. I feel the cold floor on my bare feet. I could put on socks or turn up the heat. I do nothing much. I worry about animals. Here and in Africa and the last cloud leopard. I want to write a check to make their lives better. I'm out of stamps. I want to call a friend who is still in Vietnam. But it's noon here, at midnight there. I call anyway, as if he could answer.
Now, this poem, folks, when you buy the book at RedHawkPublications.com, it's only $15, and it's worth every penny.
Get that plug in there.
I need to help this man buy groceries. But it's on page 45. Now, even though it was read like it might have been individual lines stacked up on top of one another and it flow down the page, it is not. It is a paragraph that almost reads like or presents like prose. Is there a reason behind that?
Well, there are a couple of reasons. One, it's exactly 101 words.
Now I got to count it.
So there's a little place online that has 101 word poems or stories. And I went, the nice thing about this, if I get this into this voice, if I can figure out how to do it right, and suddenly the voice takes possession of you. This is the creative part that like creatives don't understand, but we're attracted to. When you hear, it's not unusual for a novelist to say, my character just took off and they said what they wanted to say. And this sort of was the case here. But the character also had to only do it within the bounds of 101 words. So it's either flash fiction, it's a flash monologue, or it's a prose poem. And there's a lot of argument about what fits where within that. But this one, and there's one that is done like a Facebook status posted by Betty that's in this same genre, doesn't worry about lineation, is more concerned about the sentence and the progression within the sentence and the voice speaking.
What about the ambiguity of the last line? As if he could answer.
Yeah, so this is, the character to me is semi-depressed and probably with PTSD, and who has a part of the past. You know that something's going on as you go through with this guy, but until you get to the Vietnam part, you don't realize that, and people with PTSD or people with stress systems, they live in this crucial moment. And a lot of us do that. There's a crucial moment that is with us, no matter what we do.
Usually having to do with our parents.
That would be Freudian and Adlerian. But certainly, speaking back to Philip Larkin, who had his own parent problems or mommy issues. For men who've been in Vietnam and were very, because once you face death together with someone else, there's a bond there that no one else can really understand truly. And I wanted, because as we say at my house, Paul's tribe, we're often people that we hire that are people that, you would recognize the diagnosis. Like we're scattered until we're not, and then it's like, boom, we're right on it. We're obsessive. We over-detail what we talk about. We love, anything like one Star. Well, someone will focus on like one Star Wars character for years, but that designing empathy is a project, cognitive and otherwise, that people that are good at empathy don't understand the work of it. So those of us that work on it, like poetry to me in a way is to work at that. One of the emotional tools of poetry is to work at that kind of empathy for me. So looking out, a lot of poets prefer to look in and to look at their direct experience. To me, my project is to look out and try to generate and understand the kind of empathy that is not immediate to me and to others in my place. That and for people who have that, that seems like how can that be a project? But those of us who don't have it well, that don't have it under control, or that just either weren't born with it or don't care or don't give a damn, it's hard to tell the difference. Is to try to get into a touch with that world of understanding where other people are. And so since I haven't had exactly that experience, having not been a Vietnam veteran, but quite a different play in that time and period, I want to know those men in a way. And this was a poem into which I could try to touch the men that I knew that had that kind of experience. Just like Betty, who we talked about, I wanted to understand what it was like in my head to be a middle-aged divorcee with adult children who is finding out something about who she is for herself.
See, and that's one of the marvelous things. This prose poem proves that poetry is always worth revisiting. And since most poetry is short, you can read those things over and over again. The first time you read this poem, I do this, I do that, you think, I want to call a friend who is still in Vietnam. And your internal movie theater in your head, maybe pictures a friend that lives in Vietnam. It's only when you get to the last line that you can kind of get flummoxed and you think, as if he could. And then you go back, revisit the poem, a friend who is still in Vietnam. He's still in Vietnam because that's where he died. That's
Right.
where he is buried, or that's where he disappeared, or, we might not even know where he is. That's the last time we saw him. And then it's noon here and midnight there, I'll call anyway, as if he could answer. That's a double dip of fantastic emotion given to you by one poem.
Thank you.
And it can be a triple dip or a quadruple. I mean, because you sew these things into these poems that bear going back and going over them again. I tell my students all the time with Emily Dickinson, don't just read an Emily Dickinson poem once. Read it 10 times, because you're going to find 10 different things
Right.
that are going to just not only flummox you, but they're going to enlighten you. And music's the same way. Every time
Yeah.
you drop that tone arm on that favorite song, it gives you something else. Your poetry is the same way, and that's why
Well,
I brought
thank you
that
so
poem
much.
up, is because this is like one of my favorites in the book
Well, thank you.
because of that ability to do that.
It's 101 words.
101 words.
And he will count it.
Not to say. So this is to speak back to Patty's question about right brain and left brain. This one has things that satisfy the urge to count, and they try to satisfy the urge to explore emotion and connect with other people.
No one gets out of this room until you answer me this question. I'm so fixated on the manuscript of poems that crashed on the moon's surface. A, how did that happen, and which poems are they?
Okay, so I have to figure out how to make this a short story because it could be quite long. As you know, I've worked in libraries and archives, and the ideas of digital archives and of free information since the 80s. So as a copyleft kind of person, as trying to create masses of public domain and other accessible documents, and to keep them digitally accessible to all people everywhere. So this is the background of what iBiblio is, the project that I did originally as Sunsight. A lot of it's had to do with open source and free software in which people voluntarily collaborate to make products that are useful to all mankind. I know a bunch of different people doing something, and I was connected to a guy named Nova Spivak. Nova's name was actually familiar to me because his mother is a poet named Catherine Spivak, and his grandfather was the guy who invented modern management, Peter Drucker. So Nova had created some businesses that had made him some money on the internet, and he had created a business called Arc Mission, which is an archive mission. The idea is to try to collect as much human knowledge as you can in a preserved form and place it at different places where it could be discovered. So in the bottom of an Austrian salt mine, his first outing was to engrave the Isaac Asimov Foundation trilogy into thin quartz sheets and put them in the glove compartment of a Tesla that SpaceX sent, the one that's playing Rocket Man by Elton John, eternally, or at least until the battery runs out. It also has, Nova had managed to get Elon Musk to let him place this payload of quartz, and very thin sheets of quartz engraved of Foundation trilogy. So he said, I've got this even better plan. So he called me up and said, his friend says we need to talk because I've got this idea, but I don't know how to, what to put in it. And I've got the technology behind it. Technology is micro thin nickel plates, because nickel is non-reactive, that you can put several hundred, if not more, in the size of what a CD, if people remember those. Mm-hmm. And if you made the top layer one that people would know it was something, to create something like a Rosetta Stone, but let's do several million pages, Paul. I just need to know how to get all of Wikipedia, how to get all of the stuff at brewsterkalesarchive.org, how to get other things. And so we talked for a long time about what to have there and how to get things done and how to be inclusive. Because at first he went, I've got all these things. I went, well, they're all in English, and that's not a good long bet. Think about the Rosetta Stone. The more, it's 3 languages made it possible to crack, whereas things in other languages were lost when the people were lost, even though the civilization might have been quite high. So the more languages we can get, so there are several projects you want to look at, and so I pointed him at the Rosetta Project that the Long Now Foundation does. I pointed him at the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which is in every language of every UN member, every official language. So that's really very good. And then as we talked, we also talked about children's books, that how children used to read with that. And he said, well, this guy, I'm going to put my mother's poems up there, and this guy that used to babysit for me, who was her teacher, Robert Lowell.
Just Robert Lowell.
I'm gonna something that may possibly be questionable for Child Protective Services, that Robert Lowell was Nova's babysitter. Lowell was, poets are great poets, but not necessarily consistently great people. See Philip Larkin. But so he said, send me a manuscript and we'll put how much ever you have on there. So I hadn't met you guys, so I didn't have a really good manuscript yet. I went, how the hell are you going to do this? Who's going to do it? He said, I've got these Israeli guys that are trying to do the X Challenge, which the idea was who could land something on the moon, who could bounce 3 times and whatever. And they were young Israeli engineers who had a very interesting and slightly risky way of doing this with less fuel, with less rocket. And they had this lander. And he said, I think I found the way to raise money for this. I have to put a whole bunch of things on from Israeli school children. And I go, well, this is perfect. I mean, what the hell? Because they were also multilingual. And sure enough, he got this. We have this package of micro-thin nickel that is engaged. It is, you can see it with your eye first, and then it instructs you to step down and look with you, so you know something's there. And then with microscopes, you can get down further and further, and there's some compression because there's also some audio. And he said, like, what else am I going to do? I went, well, I don't know. There's some non-verbal cultures. I think I would just like ask them how they would like to be represented in something like this. So we had some, somehow he has some compressed video on there, but it's all zeros and ones, you know.
Binary.
But there are instructions on how to do this. Sure enough, Nova was there when the rocket went off, and it took a while because it goes around the Earth a few times to pick up speed, and then it slingshots out to the moon and picked up by the moon's gravity and slings around that. Everything was going great. Like, it made it. There's so many ways it could go wrong. It was encircling the moon. It was really great. And the Israelis were like ready to land it. And they went, we'll do this in person because it's like too hard for the computer. Bam! It fell from 4 miles directly into the moon. And shattered into God knows how many millions of pieces. But the material engineers on the other side said, that had worked on it for Nova said, well, you know, there's no atmosphere, so like it probably wouldn't have overheated when it fell. The gravitational force will be great at that kind of fall. So it could have shattered, but if it landed in a bunch of dust, I mean, who knows? So it's either there, this manuscript, along with Lowell and Kathleen Spivak and all of Wikipedia in every known language, and all of the archives from archive.org, and God knows what else that, I'm not supposed to tell about because we don't know how copyright works on the moon.
Well, it's like a Schrodinger's manuscript on the moon anyway.
Exactly.
It's neither there nor not there.
Well, we have no idea.
We have no idea, yeah.
It could be shredded like Egyptian papyri, or it could be whole.
Yeah, so it's like, is the cat alive, or is it dead, or even does it exist? So.
Well, we know it actually did exist. We actually saw it go on the rocket, or I didn't see it, but I saw the video of it going on the rocket.
With the little bit of time we've got left, Patty, you wanted to talk about some of Paul's upcoming appearances.
And you do have a few that are coming up, and we've been in touch with Ashe County, for example. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're going to be doing with the On the Same Page Literary Festival in West Jefferson, September 13th and 17th?
So I have 3 things that they're asking me to do. Two readings, one in West Jefferson at the Ashe County Public Library, and one at a great little place, the Old Orchard General Store in Lansing, North Carolina, which is known best for the home of Molly Chomper's Cider and Pie on the Mountain, which is a pizza place, and a beautiful part of the Virginia Creeper Trail up there. And they have a brand new bookstore there at the Old Orchard General Store that sells. Old Orchard is a blueberry farm largely outside of a few miles away. And so lots of blueberry products, lots of beer and wine that might, in fact, lots of gifts, and a lot of books that have to do with Western North Carolina. Cool. Particularly the Ashe County, Boone, Watauga County area, because that's where they're near. And then I'll also be doing a panel about publishing, which I think Landing on the Moon might come up.
Yeah.
Because it always does, with Ed Southern, who runs the North Carolina Writers Network, Jamie Southern, his wife, who runs Bookmarks in Winston-Salem, and Georgianne Eubanks, I think, who's done a number of books about touring North Carolina, particularly most recently about Saving the Wild South, about plants, and Literary Trails of North Carolina, and Judy Goldman from Charlotte, who has a new memoir out as well as a couple of novels. So we'll talk about publishing, and I get to talk about Redhawk somewhat.
Please do. And please direct everybody to RedHawkPublications.com.
And we always encourage people, as you listen to this, please make sure that you like, share, subscribe to Cure All the World's Ails. I think that's about it, guys. We want to thank you very much for being our guest today and for being so
Yeah, this has been
instructional.
terrific.
Yeah, this has been helpful.
Thank you. Well, I love poetry and I read poetry. And those are two things I think that are required. That to read poetry across time and of your interest, and to have those voices to be in conversation with and in fellowship with across time and across cultures is a great gift and also a lot of damn fun.
And also a great gift is to be able to meet this man in person and see him read, see him perform his marvelous works. He is indefatigable when it comes to touring and reading. So if he appears nearby, please go out and see him. If you are up to a nice road trip, get in the car and go to, Ashe County, or go down to, what'd you say, Winston-Salem, or where was the new bookstore?
The bookstore is in Lansing, North Carolina,
Lansing,
in
North
Ashe
Carolina.
County. But I'll also be doing a reading event in Hillsborough, North Carolina on September 10 with Sally Green, who's just done a book with the University of Mississippi Press of Elizabeth Spencer's Edward stories, and is also a county commissioner in Orange County, among other great attributes. Then on September 11 at Scuppernong Books in Greensboro, Sunday afternoon, I'll be doing a reading there with Pat Revere Seal, who's has a new book out from Main Street Rag, and Kathleen Kehoe, who is a poet and incidentally a librarian living in Greensboro.
I see, folks, there is art all around you, and it's just within a short drive. And again, going to see this guy and listen to him, Paul Jones, thank you so much for coming to see us today. And I think that's about it.
And we'd like to thank our engineer for today, Richard Eller, director and Grand Poobah of RedPubPod Publications.
He's the boss man. So thank you for tuning in to RedPubPod.
Thank you.
RedPubPod.
RedPubPod. RedPubPod.
RedPubPod. You got it. It's close.
It's a little bit of a tongue twister.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
You've tuned into
RedPubPod.
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 A podcast
RedPubPod.
from Redhawk Publications.
It's a little bit of a tongue twister.